lights come up.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Forum, the gateway to Columbia's Manhattanville campus. I'm Mary McGee. I'm the executive director of the Forum. The Forum is one of Columbia's newest resources. We opened a little over a year ago, and we are still in the process of transforming this space into place. Tonight's event is a significant part of that process as it highlights one of the Forum's goals, namely to collaborate with community partners in fostering community engagement that is innovative, transformative, and forward-looking. The Studio Museum in Harlem ticks off all of these boxes and then some. As a Harlem-based, internationally respected center for creative work and works inspired by Black culture. Last month, it was our great pleasure to host right here in this space, right here at the Forum, in these same two chairs, Sir David Adjaye, architect for the Studio Museum's new building, who joined Thelma Golden in a conversation as part of Columbia World Project's series on urban ethics. We are especially pleased to welcome Thelma back this evening, and it's our great pleasure to collaborate with the Studio Museum in hosting the Lea C. Green's Artist Talk with renowned photographer and educator Dawoud Bey, whose work challenges us to see in new ways and to question how we engage with and represent community. Columbia Manhattanville was designed to be a campus without gates or walls so as to welcome and encourage the flow of diverse ideas and people. In addition to the scheduled workshops, symposiums, lectures, and conversations that we have up here in our meeting rooms, downstairs in the atrium level where you all came in, which is open to the community 7 days a week from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., artists, students, entrepreneurs, bus drivers, families, neighbors, all come in and find a quiet space to work, sketch, have a pop-up meeting, study or read, or just take a break from the hecticness of our lives. To our Studio Museum colleagues and the Green family, thank you for helping the Forum's efforts to engage our community with inspiring individuals and ideas by bringing Dawoud Bey to speak here tonight. It's partners like you, our neighbors, who are helping to make this space, this forum, a real place, a shared place, committed to fostering understanding, shared learning, and well-being. Neighbors supporting neighbors. We welcome you to the Forum tonight and every day. And now let me hand this over to Lynn E Green to introduce tonight's event and share how Lea's life inspired the creation of the endowment fund that brings us here tonight. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Mary, for that kind introduction. And we are so pleased with this partnership with the Forum at Columbia University and to be using your beautiful space tonight. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for the 4th annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk. I'm Lynn E Green, and I'm so grateful to stand before you to introduce our artist and to tell you a bit more about my sister. Lea wasn't just an arts professional. She lived this work, and she was always looking to immerse herself in art, support the development and visibility of artists of African descent, and to see what she can learn by partnering with people. Lea honed her skills, widened her network, and deepened her passion for the arts while working at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Whether through her work with the Contemporary Friends, which was a seminal young collectors program, or later as the director of special projects, the Studio Museum community became Lea's extended family. She considered the Studio Museum her second home, and art was her world. After her passing in 2014, my mother and I knew that we had to do something to honor her life and the work that she was so passionate about. So it was so fitting that in 2015, under the leadership of Thelma Golden, who was one of Lea's dear friends, we were able to start the Lea K. Green Memorial Endowment Fund at the Studio Museum. This fund, which many of you have been supporting over the years, supports public programs, notably the annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk. And this allows us to engage in rich and meaningful conversations with artists of African descent at all stages of their careers. In 2016, we held our first Artist Talk featuring the amazing Carrie Mae Weems. In 2017, we were so honored to be joined by Jordan Casteel, who is here with us tonight. And most recently, in 2018, we were thrilled to feature Amy Sherald. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce the fourth Lea K. Green Artist Honoree, Dawoud Bey. Dawoud Bey was born in New York in 1953 and began his career as an artist in 1975 with a series of photographs, Harlem USA, that were later exhibited in his first one-person exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979. He has since had numerous exhibitions worldwide, and his works are included in collections of institutions throughout the country. In 2020, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art will open a major retrospective exhibition of Bey's work that will also travel to the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. Bey is the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship, and he holds a Master's of Fine Arts degree from the Yale University School of Art. And he is currently a professor of art at Columbia College, Chicago. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Thelma Golden and Dawoud Bey.
Thank you, Lynn E. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Hello. Hello. How is everyone? Well, I am thrilled and pleased to be back here at the Forum, this amazing space at Columbia University. Thank you for having us. Thrilled to be here with Dawoud, an artist who I deeply admire. Thrilled to be here for this fourth annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk. I think of Lea every day, and it fills me with great joy when I think of the opportunity to celebrate all she meant to the museum and all she meant to me with this talk. As Lynn said, Lea, I laugh when I hear that title, Director of Special Projects. Lea basically was my everything. When I became director, Lea, who was a friend, joined me in this endeavor and really planted the seeds for this moment that we are in now. Right? She was there with me thinking of what it meant for me to think about the Studio Museum in its future. So I think about her as we live in this moment at the museum and love that we can celebrate her. And thrilled that tonight I get to talk to Dawoud. Now, I realized when we were in the green room that, as you just heard, this is our fourth talk, but I realized that we're making some history here in that Dawoud is our first male identifying artist in the Lea K. Green.
Why, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure what that means, but thank you.
It's important, and I feel it's important to say. But really, why I was eager to have this opportunity to talk to Dawoud is, as you heard, next year we are all going to have the opportunity to see this 40-year survey. That alone, I think, I want to say, when we talk about artist career and we talk about this idea of making work, the fact that you have been practicing for 40 years and this exhibition is coming. So I thought this was an incredible moment to be able to go backwards, but also to sort of sit in this moment as we get ready to be able to see your exhibition. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you. We've known each other a long time. Two people from St. Albans, Queens.
We were just talking about that. That is our essential bond, right? It's Queens. All right, I'm trying to make this move. Fantastic. That's not where I thought it was going to go. Okay, you all are going to work with, oh, exactly. Thank you. Right, that's where I wanted to begin. Because I said I want to begin at the beginning. And the reason this conversation is so rich and full right now, as you all know, we are celebrating our 51st year at the Studio Museum in Harlem. We're looking forward to this life we are going to have in our new building. But that has made it possible for me and for many of us who work at the Studio Museum to have spent a lot of time in these recent years thinking about the museum's past. And no one knows more about that moment than you do, Dawoud, because you've really been a part of the Studio Museum almost from the beginning.
From its inception.
That's right, from its inception. And you have witnessed and documented so much of the Studio Museum's life. So can you talk about how you first became acquainted with the museum, what that meant at that moment, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit about what the Studio Museum was in those days. This moment, 1978, portrait of you by the amazing Marilyn Nance at the museum.
Well, the Studio Museum in Harlem was certainly instrumental, crucial, instrumental to the formation of my community, the community of artists that I became a part of. My first encounter with the museum is actually an interesting one because I had accompanied my mother to the museum for a community meeting that a friend of hers who was a foster parent was a part of. And they were meeting at the Studio Museum in Harlem. So that was actually my first encounter with the museum. I don't even know how old I was, 13, 14, 15, maybe. But moving forward, Studio Museum in Harlem, how did I first come to be there? I mean, you see me sitting here in a room in the upstairs area of the museum when it was still located at 2033 Fifth Avenue. And at that location and at that particular time, okay, it just came to me. Here's what happened.
Okay.
Here's what happened. I was a student at Queensborough Community College, maybe 1973, 4. And I was a part of the Black Student Union. And one February, a group of artists came up to Queensborough Community College to do a talk. It was 3 artists, Leroy Clark, Helen Van Duran, and John Kendrick. And I struck up a conversation with them, and as we ended that conversation, Leroy Clark, who was one of the first artists in residence at the museum, Leroy said, "Why don't you come and visit? Feel free to come to the studio and visit me sometime." So I took him up on his invitation to visit the Studio Museum and to visit him in his studio. And that began the beginning of a very deep relationship with the community of artists who were there at that time, who also included Valerie Maynard. But Leroy Clark was the artist that I established the most ongoing conversation with. And then interestingly enough, there was another artist in residence there, Lloyd Stevens. And Lloyd Stevens was also a drummer. And he kept his drums.
I'm gonna go with it too.
He kept his drums in the closet in his studio. And when I finished talking with Leroy, and these conversations would go on for hours. I would go in the morning and maybe around 1 o'clock or so. Lloyd would suggest, why don't we play?
Yeah.
So Lloyd would take his drums out, and he and I would drum for a while. I was still a drummer at that point.
I think it's important to point that out, Dawoud, that your trajectory into your creativity you started as a musician.
Very much so. I was a drummer, and I don't think you can talk about that in the past tense. I am a drummer, although I don't play professionally anymore. But I was taught by a number of master drummers at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. Oluwaseyi Wiles, Kwame Ashangi Wazak, Chief Bey. They were the first generation of teachers of traditional West African drumming here in New York. And I kind of came up in that community and studied with them. So music was my first expressive form.
Exactly. And so how did you make the transition from music into being a visual artist? I mean, I'm coming back to this photograph
yeah, this is me and David playing up in his studio.
Exactly.
David's a musician too, pocket trumpet, marimba. He kept the drum in his studio, so I would go by and we would just improvise some music. And I think what began to happen, making music is a group activity. It requires doing it with other people. It requires those people showing up. And the more of a commitment it becomes, it requires them showing up on time. And there was a certain amount of frustration making work in a way that depended on 4 or 5, and in some of the bands I was in, 6 people showing up. I already had gotten my first camera.
How did that happen?
Years before. So I had a camera. I got my first camera from my godmother when I was 16 years old. Right before I went to see the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met, which was another really important moment for me. So I already had the camera. I didn't know what to do with it. And as I became increasingly frustrated with the life of a working musician, I decided maybe I should think a little bit more about photography. You know, this expressive form that I could actually practice on my own. I didn't have to wait for anyone. I could just take my camera and go out into the world and make my work.
And it seems that act in and of itself is what defines so much of what we understand about your work, right? You going out in the world and capturing it. I'm showing here this work from 1977 on Lenox Avenue. And clearly at that moment, and since, Harlem has been an important part of your photographic practice. Can you talk about these works from the Harlem USA, your absolutely masterful series that captures this community in its fullness, stands as one of the sort of documents that trace this century, right? You in the 70s, but taking on from what we know of those sort of great moments that Harlem has been captured. But can you talk about what led you to the streets of Harlem?
Well, my motivation for being in Harlem with a camera actually goes back to my family history. My mother and father met in Harlem. So that's the beginning of my history. Really, because if they had not met in Harlem, I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation.
That's right.
Yeah, so Harlem is central to my own, Harlem is central to my own personal narrative. And at some point, as I was trying to figure out the question of what my subject would be. Because as a photographer, that's one of the central questions. What's your subject going to be? And between my family's history in Harlem, having spent time as a young boy in Harlem with my mother and father and other family friends who hadn't left Harlem, and the experience of seeing the photographs at the Met in the Harlem on my Mind exhibition, those two experiences led me to want to begin my first project in Harlem as a way of familiarizing or maybe re-familiarizing myself with the community that I had been introduced to as a child by my mother and father, but had never spent considerable time in. So that was one of the motivations, is the going back to look into one's past in the contemporary moment. And then the other was wanting to contribute something to the ongoing history of Harlem's representation, and also the ongoing history of significant cultural expression that came out of Harlem, and wanting to, in my own way, add something to that history by making a certain kind of photograph. And the way I made photographs evolved as I continued working. This is actually maybe 2 years into the work in which the photographs start to become more loosely structured, more about gesture, timing, and this kind of spontaneous improvisation that takes place in the streets. But it was motivated by both of those things, my mother and father's history, my own family history here, and the broader cultural history of Harlem.
But it also seems, in looking at these photographs, you also are definitely thinking about and referencing a history of African-American photographers. Can you talk about some of those influences and how you brought those ideas into the work?
Well, most immediately, Roy De Carava. Roy De Carava stands pretty much at the center of the beginning of my practice as a photographer, because Roy De Carava was the one photographer that the one African-American photographer who I encountered, who was making photographs not as a way of merely documenting or making photographs for newspapers, publications, or magazines, but he was engaged in the act of photographing the black subject as an expressive act, using the camera. This was his art form. And for that reason, this idea of being able to take the camera and to devise a particular visual and material language with the camera around the African-American subject, De Carava was really central to my early thinking. And even more recently, his book, The Sweet Flypaper of Life, that was the book that kind of awakened my sensibilities to the possibilities of what photographs could be.
Yeah. This is one of your most iconic photographs. And I always know that for artists, that's complicated, right? An image that lives in the world in this large way. But I'm curious, when you look at this, as I know you've been made to look at it over and over and over again, what it is that you think about that is different than when you initially took this photograph? How has the distance of time and this photograph's life in the world changed your sense of its beginnings?
Well, I don't know if it answers the question directly, but one of the things that I very much think about as I look at this work, I was very young when I was making these photographs. Really. I was very young when I was making these photographs, 21, 22, 23.
Yeah.
I have a son that's 27.
Right.
You know, so that gives me a certain sense of context. But I was very young making these photographs, but I had spent a lot of time looking at photographs on my own, going to museums and galleries, the Met Marlborough Gallery, MoMA, where I saw photographs by Mike Farmer, Walker Evans, Richard Avedon. I had a kind of intense early self-education
Yeah.
in terms of looking at a lot of photographs, trying to figure out what kind of photographs do I want to make, and what kinds of photographs do I want my work to be in conversation with. So I think overall, when I look at the work now, from the vantage point of having made like this photograph some 43 years ago, I'm impressed with that young man. I really am. You know, from a distance of now, looking back, and also as someone who's been teaching for a very long time, who have students who are maybe the age that I was when I was making this work. But I had really steeped myself in the history and done a lot of looking. So I had, by the time I went out and tried to execute this work, I had a very high standard. I wanted to make photographs like that.
Yeah.
I wanted to make photographs that excited me the way De Carava's photographs excited me, or the way Walker Evans' photographs excited me. And I also had a very good sense of form,
Yes.
how to move things around within the rectangular space of the picture in order to make the subject coherent and resonant. So, yeah, I'm impressed with that young man.
I think it continues to impress viewers seeing this work, right, over and over in the years. Central to your work is picturing the Black subject and the importance, it seems, of representation and the way in which that is not only a photographic conversation, but a cultural and a historic one. Can you talk about the impetus for thinking about representation so specifically in your work, and showing here some of the street portraits that are later, but we'll move into some of the serial works that you've been taking portraits.
Those ideas were certainly already at play when I began the Harlem USA photographs. I was very conscious of the fact that the Black community, the Black urban community, or the Black subject in general, there was a very long history of representing the Black subject through a lens of social pathology, or through a lens of the grotesquely stereotypical, and part of the fundamental project of the work that I've been doing for a very long time, including going back to Harlem USA and these photographs from the 80s, has been to make not what I would call a positive representation, because that kind of negative-positive binary is kind of problematic. I was always more interested in making what I consider to be an honest representation of the subject. And with these works here, the street portraits from the 80s, which were made also using black and white Polaroid material, the idea of the subject in the photograph being in possession of the images that I was making of them became important as well. So in all of these photographs, you know, there's the instant photograph that results.
Wow.
and then the instant reusable negative that I then used to make exhibition prints. But trying to find a way to my practice to engage the hierarchical nature of the relationship that's established between subject and photography, and to try to negotiate a relationship and a practice that was a more dialogical one. So this work here also, although we're stopped on the one photograph in which the subject's eyes are veiled, this was also about the gaze of the black subject towards the camera, and by extension, the gaze of the black subject towards the viewer, who I always imagined as being standing in front of these photographs, having an exchange with the subject in a way that was perhaps more intimate than the relationship that they might have actually had with them in the real world.
In real life, right.
Yeah, right. In the real world. Yeah. And to try to create that kind of reciprocal relationship between viewer and subject that could then hopefully extend back out into the world.
Your work has very explicitly taken on history and written histories through the creation of images. That has happened through many different projects, but it seems in a way, in this moment, it seems profound and powerful to talk about the Birmingham Project and both your idea and how that body of work came to be, but also how it then existed in the world as a way for us to, in the present, look back and understand the past. Can you talk a bit about this series?
Well, the Birmingham Project goes back to a moment when I was 11 years old. And my parents brought home a book called The Movement. And it was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. And there was a text that had been written by Lorraine Hansberry to kind of weave the photographs together into the shape of a book. And there were a number of horrific photographs in that book, lynching photographs, just photographs of all the things that I guess you could say my mother and father had tried to shield me from up until that moment. And there was one photograph in particular in the book that seared its way into my psyche. And it was a photograph of Sarah Jean Collins, who was the older sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And she was lying in a hospital bed in the aftermath of the blast. And her eyes were covered in heavy gauze bandages. And looking at that photograph, everything changed for me. That was one of those moments where I guess you could mark my life as my life before that photograph and my life after that photograph. And over the years, I saw that photograph initially when I was 11 years old. And over many, many, many years, I suppose I parked that image in some part of my psyche. And one morning, I can't remember exactly when now, but I would say one morning, maybe 45, 50 years later, I had an experience where I finally learned what it means to sit bolt upright in bed. Like I had heard that expression, to sit bolt upright in bed. And it just sounded like an interesting expression. But it happened. Right. It happened. I literally, early one morning, sat bolt upright in bed as if someone had smacked me on the back of the head. And what came flashing back was that image of that girl lying in the hospital bed. And so I told myself I need to do something with this. I obviously haven't forgotten. I don't know and can't remember what dislodged it. Right. But the only response that I could figure was to go to Birmingham. Mm-hmm. I need to figure out how to make work about this. I need to go to the place where this happened. And so that began several years of visiting Birmingham. The first visit, I visited the 16th Street Baptist Church, introduced myself to the minister, had a very interesting conversation, which in this context, I don't think I can go into all of the nuances, but I began to have a much deeper appreciation for the way history actually unfolds, as the way, as opposed to the mythic way that we tend to receive history when it's tidied up. So that started 7 years of going back and forth, meeting people, introducing myself to people in the community. Even as I tried to figure out what could I possibly make out of this traumatic moment. I didn't merely want to go to the church and make a photograph of 16th Street Baptist Church. That seemed conceptually completely inadequate to the ambitions that I had. And eventually, after several years, I decided to make portraits of those young people who had been killed on September 15th, 1963. Through my research over all that time, I found out that not only had 4 girls been killed, but 2 boys, 2 African-American boys, had also been killed in the violent aftermath of that morning. And so I decided to make photographs of African-American boys and African-American girls who were the same ages as the 6 young African-Americans who had been killed, which still left the work feeling incomplete, because I wanted to somehow address the issue of the passage of time, absence, loss, memory, which then led me to think about photographing African-American adults who were the ages that these young people would have been had they not been killed 50 years later. Because at the time I was making the work, it was exactly 50 years after the dynamiting of the church. And so I started making portraits not only of young people who were those ages, but African Americans. So if the girls were 11 and 14, and the boys were 13 and 16, so this is probably a 13-year-old boy, and the man is probably 63. As a way of figuring out how does one, as you described it, how does one visualize the past in the contemporary moment? Right. How can one evoke the past in the contemporary moment in a way that has real resonance? Over the years that I was doing the research, I was having conversations with the Birmingham Museum of Art. And at some point, they told me that the 50th year of this moment is approaching. And we've been talking about this for several years. And if we're going to do this, we should aim to do this exhibition in 2013. And then that, with that commitment, that began to accelerate the way in which I was working. I made the photographs in 2 different locations as a way of wrapping 2 pieces of Birmingham's social history around the subjects. The photographs in the church are made at Bethel Baptist Church, which was the church that was pastored by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a church that was very central to the movement. It's the place where the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was actually created. And then the other photographs were made in the 17th or 18th century room of the Birmingham Museum of Art itself, because the Birmingham Museum of Art, like all public institutions during that time in the past, was a segregated institution. So I wanted to wrap the black communal space of the church and the segregated, once segregated social space and social history of the museum, and have that be the context in which the work was made. And then when I completed this project, the work was shown at the Birmingham Museum of Art almost exactly 50 years to the day of the dynamiting of the church.
And what was the response, Dawoud? Because it feels to me what this project has done is really operate in a way when we think about sort of like public knowledge and public reckoning, what we now sort of speak about around historic reconciliation. It seemed to me this project lived in that space for the Birmingham community.
Well, to give that a little bit of context, when I completed the Harlem USA photographs, I very specifically wanted to show those photographs in a space in the community in which the photographs had been made, so that the people who are the subjects of the work could have access to the work. To try to use the institutional space in a very intentional kind of way, which came out of my early experience at the Met in 1969 with Harlem on My Mind, which was a very auspicious moment to see one's first exhibition in a museum, and people were speaking back to the museum and protesting the Met exhibition for a number of reasons. So from the outset, I had a clear sense that the institutional space of the museum was not a benign space. That it could be engaged, that it could be spoken back to, and that one could shape a series of relationships around that space. Because certainly, in the case of the Birmingham Project, the adults are old enough to remember when they couldn't legally enter that museum. Let alone would they have thought that they would see life-size images of themselves in that museum. So that is the other piece of the work. The other conceptual piece is how to continue an ongoing conversation with institutional space, and as an artist, reshape the way in which that space is engaged, and in some ways to use the making of my work as a catalyst to expand the audience of participation within the space of the museum. And that's been true pretty much from the outset.
You've been consistent in that as a strategy. It seems to me your work has traveled through many different dialogues in photography, right? You have engaged deeply in the documentary, but the work has also embraced a sort of conceptual sort of format. You've operated within portraiture and the figure as being central to the work and moved towards landscape. And I think it's interesting that during this time, you also have been teaching photography. So can you talk about the implications of this conversation about photography and its uses in this moment?
Well, I think going back to when I first started making work, there was, for those of us who considered ourselves artists who wanted to make work with the camera, there was a very particular tradition that one worked within. Here in New York, even Roy de Carava You know, that was black and white, small camera pictures. And it was actually, it was described as the New York school, because they weren't doing that in California. The tradition was very different.
Yeah.
So I was operating at that time very much within the tradition of what would be called the New York school, in which the questioning of the veracity of documentary practice hadn't yet become a part of the conversation, or a broader acknowledgement of the subjectivities of the work. The inherent subjectivities of the work had not been a part of the conversation. And so for me, you know, the evolution of my work has also been about a kind of reconsideration of those various conversations that are going on around the medium of photography, and how to, for me, how to subjectively make work that responds to these shifting and changing issues that are at play. And teaching has certainly been, over the long years that I've been teaching, and I actually started teaching for the first time at the Studio Museum in Harlem. So Studio Museum in Harlem is also where I became a teacher.
What year was that, Dawoud? What year was that?
1976, 1977, and one of the first students to walk into that class, as you know, was Carrie Mae Weems.
That's right. She credits you with her entire move into photography, having trained as an anthropologist, but coming into that class and you encouraging her to tell stories with pictures. Right? She was documenting stories and engaging stories, but you really, she always credits you with that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, teaching in a very real and dynamic and immediate way keeps me in a conversation with the medium in a critical way. And it also allows me to access the way in which younger photographers are thinking about the medium, even as it allows me to also bring a set of values to that, to root the work in a set of critical values, to suggest how and why the work that we do can matter,
Right.
and how and why the work that we do should matter. So it allows me to continue to be a part of that conversation with a younger group of artists. And I think it's kind of like, you know, some of you might know the music, you know, Miles Davis always wanted young people in his band. Yeah, I don't want to play with no old people. I want to play with young people. Like I want to know what young people are doing. And I think teaching kind of allows for that. It keeps you in conversation with what young artists are doing,
Right.
even as it allows you to bring your experience to bear on
To
that.
them, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I answered your question.
No, that did. And in this moment, I've been showing some of these
Yeah, this is
newer
Harlem
photos
Redux.
of Harlem, and I've been fascinated with these because, as you well know, having been in Harlem, you know, Dawoud has been away from New York for some time, but I enjoy how much when you come to New York, you always come back to Harlem. And in that regard, you have watched Harlem change, right, so radically, and you've documented it. And I know we are grateful for that, not only because, you know, again, they take your sort of genius of a compositional eye, right, and create these sort of beautiful, amazing, intriguing works of art, but also they so deeply capture these moments that quickly are gone, right, and something new.
That was the impetus for this work, because I had been as I still do, visiting Harlem periodically. And at one point, the rate at which the community began to physically change, the way space in the community was beginning to change and be reshaped around the people in this community, was something that I wanted to insert myself into and make work about the way in which the space was being transformed at the moment that it was happening, not the aftermath of that, but to show what it looks like as various forces, whether it's forces of gentrification, whether it's forces of the influx of global capital, but how all of that begins to reshape the urban landscape of Harlem. And I wanted to make work about that had a real sense of immediacy, which is why they're in color. Like this is happening right now. Within the medium of photography, which is also why the Birmingham work is in black and white, by the way. I'm talking about the past, and the photographic material of the past has traditionally been black and white. So that was why the Birmingham photographs are black and white. This work is in color because it's a very current story. They're also very large scale, which is also a part of the contemporary object quality of photographs. When I made the Harlem photographs and showed them, they were small, black and white, very classically scaled, which was the way photographs, you know, that were not commercial photographs, that's the way they were shown, and that's what indicated what kinds of photographs they were. And so this work is really about trying to visualize and create a visual language to talk about the way in which shape is being transformed around people in the community, and the way space is being transformed for new people who are coming into the community. And what's significant about this work is that it's the first time that I began working in a way that was not based primarily on the human subject or the portrait.
That's right.
Where I first started looking at space and place as the subject of the work. And I have to admit, it was very difficult work. It required me to learn a different language and to apply that language to a particular set of intentions. So this was probably, this work is what allowed me to make all of the work that has come after.
Right. And that's where, before we open it up to questions, I want to end. And I will admit, I could have spent the whole evening talking about this new work, Dawoud, because I think, like many, I have just been so deeply inspired by this body of work. It is haunting, it's beautiful, it feels very current, right? It seems to picture a whole way in which we are living in the world right now, but then it also feels as if, in so many ways, when looking at these works, that there are indications of your path all along the way in this body of work. So this is your installation, Night Coming Tenderly, Black, 2017. That was part.
Night Coming Tenderly Black.
Yes.
It's a project, photographs that were made in Cleveland, Ohio, and northeastern Ohio, that both looks at and reimagines the landscape of the Underground Railroad in that part of the country. And of course, the exact location and the exact landscape of the Underground Railroad of necessity was never known.
Right, of course.
Which is what gave me the freedom to kind of reimagine that landscape, and also to reimagine it as if through the eyes of a fugitive enslaved person moving through that landscape under cover of darkness. The title, as some of you probably recognize, comes from the last couplet of a poem, Dream Variations by Langston Hughes. And that last line is night coming tenderly, black like me. And this idea that the darkness of night can be tender, that it doesn't have to be a threatening or imposing space, that that blackness can actually be an embracing space, which also goes back to Roy de Carava's photographs, which they're very dark, and de Carava's photographs are about a material blackness, they're about a narrative blackness, and they're about finding a material equivalent for the experience of the black subject moving through or coming out of this blackness. So that work was initially shown in St. John's Episcopal Church. That installation photograph that you saw, if you click back maybe to, I don't know.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, this church is actually St. John's Episcopal Church, is a church in Cleveland that was, in fact, a known site of the Underground Railroad. It was actually the final, what they called Underground Railroad station, where fugitive slaves took refuge as they waited in the belfry for the signal from Lake Erie, so that they would come down and make maybe that 1 mile passage to Lake Erie. So again, considering the relationship of the photograph to the space, and wanting to situate these photographs about the past that were made in the contemporary moment, but to situate them in a space that was very much a part of the narrative of that past, as a way to continue this conversation, to amplify the relationship of the photographs and the place and space in which they're situated.
Yeah, and it seems also that the absence of the figure in its purposefulness is also the way in which you, for the viewer, inhabit the history of this moment, right? So if we understand and we think about the nature of the Underground Railroad and the necessity, right, for the absence of being seen, being perceived, that's what we see here. Give us these sort of vast spaces that we imagine these bodies in and moving through, you know, quietly under the cloak of darkness, but without them in the picture itself.
Yeah, because to me, the subject isn't in front of the camera. The subject is actually here, looking out. And the camera becomes a kind of vehicle or device through which we can signify the presence of the subject, but here, not in the photograph. But it's interesting because when people talk about the absence of the subject, when I was making the photographs, I was very intentionally trying to, channel might not be the right word, but to imagine these landscapes through the eyes of an enslaved person moving through the landscape. So,
and memory.
that way, while we don't see the figure in it, to me, conceptually, the figure is here.
Yes. And it seems that the works operate with a deep level of memory, right? As the way in which we sort of understand what we are seeing, but also what we don't see. That seems
how to almost inextricably pull you back. You know, and I've had people look at the photographs and come out and they ask me, you made these photographs now, right?
Right, exactly, right?
And I'm like, yeah, I made them now. They're looking kind of confused. Yeah, because it kind of pulled them back.
Right.
But that's the effect that I want this work to have, because you realize, no, I made them, so they must have been made in the contemporary moment. And yet, both through their materiality and through the narrative form,
Yeah, they resonate.
they're talking about and alluding to the past.
Very much so.
Yeah, and that's the ongoing project that I'm involved in now. I'm photographing on and around the landscape of plantations in Louisiana. So I'm continuing that history project.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to open it up for questions. I could keep talking to you all evening, but I want to open it up for questions. If anyone in our audience has questions, there are microphones on either side of the seats. We have one over here. Hello.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hi.
My name is Shango Divine, former student at Columbia, Chicago, and current student at the Parsons School of Design. Fortunately and unfortunately, I would like to first thank y'all, Miss Thelma and Mr. Dawoud. You guys are legends. You guys are storytellers. You guys are superheroes, and you guys are leaders, and it's beautiful to share this time and space with y'all. One of two questions. Mr. Dawoud, I would like to ask and understand the ways in which your work has progressed and changed as far as narrative and storytelling, and the ways it's developed and grown in ways that have gone beyond your own spectrum of existence. Just being a black body, in which ways has your narrative changed and not changed you and not led you in ways when creating these iconic works and these pillars within the black community? How has your narrative not guided your work, but informed your work and lived and breathed your existence? And two, when creating these blueprints for black existence and these plans and these stories and these narratives, how do you make sure that these are used for the future? How do you make sure these are used for the youth, you know, that are growing up and seeing these works and seeing these pillars within the black community? How do you make sure that these are put to use and built and create worlds in the future?
Thank you.
Well, those are two questions.
Yeah. you can decide, right? Take.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think that's important to the way I think about continuing to both make my work and to continue to move my work forward has to do with, I think, questions that I'm always asking myself. Because to me, the work is a response to a series of questions. You ask the questions and then you make the work in response to that. And the particular form that takes is always for me consciously a conversation with the medium, trying to make the medium function in a very subjective kind of way. And also to make work that participates in particular conversations. I think one of the things that was central to me and how I think about my work has to do with the fact that most of the conversations that I have about my work are not with photographers. They're not. And that's been true kind of like for a very long time. Because the artists that I met initially, like I talked about the experience of meeting and spending hours talking with Leroy Clark. He's a painter. You know, and we talked about making things visually, making things on the flat two-dimensional surface of a painting or a photograph, and how does one make that come alive materially. So I think my work is also very much shaped by those kinds of conversations. I think a lot of times photographs are spoken of in a way that's largely illustrative or strictly about the narrative of the thing in the photograph. But I've always been very much aware that the photograph is a photographic object. And that's how I think about the work. What kind of object do I want to make in response to this? You know, the diptych idea is a very particular kind of formal object, formal/conceptual object. So for me, the conversations that I continue to have are the things that both challenge me and are the things that continue to move my work forward. And clearly I'm committed to the idea that making work and amplifying the presence of Black people in the larger social and cultural and political landscape is central to why I do the work that I do. You know, and but how can one take that and make something that resonates in a very subjective and intentional kind of way through the manipulation of both ideas and materials in relation to those ideas. So those are the kind of conversations that I have. I don't have a lot of conversations about the what, you know. Although the what is the thing that is at the center of the work, around which one then has to, you know, use the materials to make something. But I tend to think about my work in a much broader way than just making photographs of things or people that are interesting. And since they're interesting, if I photograph them, that must be an interesting photograph. I mean, it's not the way I think about what photographs are.
There's more.
You know, I don't think about photographs that way at all.
Right. Is there a question over here?
I don't know if I answered your question, but feel free to continue this conversation after we're done.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan Pinkett. I'm an artist in residence at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And the question I have is a technical question. In your early black and white photographs, were you using a handheld meter or the in-camera meter?
Analog or digital?
Say again?
What was that question?
Your analog.
You asked, in the black and white photographs, were you using a handheld meter or
the in-camera meter?
In-camera meter.
You're talking about the actual
exposure
tools that I use to make the photograph?
Yes.
Well, I should say I'm still photographing with film.
You use +X?
And that's not to suggest that film is better than digital. It's more a long-standing habit.
Right.
When I was making the Harlem Redux work, I actually, part of the difficulty in making that work was that I got a different camera to make that work. Without getting too technical, because I know I want to make photographs that are fairly large, and I want them to have as much visual information in them as possible. For a long time, I was working with a 4x5 camera on a tripod, which kind of, you know, is the best way to work for a certain kind of highly detailed, richly descriptive, large photograph. The Harlem Redux work, it's medium format camera, handheld, but still, you know, that work was the first time that I went back out into the streets looking for things that I didn't know I was looking for until I saw them. Which was a very, I hadn't worked that way in a very long time.
But you came back to it in that work.
Yeah, it was very, I mean, I can't even emphasize how difficult that work was. But you just keep working and you work your way through it.
Yeah.
But technically, I'm still doing film. Digital on the output for some of them. The Nights Coming Tenderly Black photographs are silver prints because the kind of print that I wanted to make, it had a depth of surface that also was analogous to the kinds of prints that Roy de Carrara makes. Those photographs are like my conversation with Roy de Carrara materially.
It feels that way, right?
And you can't get that in ink on paper because the ink sits on top of the paper. With a silver print, the silver halides are actually embedded in the paper. And it gives a much richer sense of depth and the illusion of space on that flat two-dimensional surface, which was very much a part of what I wanted that work to be materially.
We have time for one more question, but it feels like also that's what we're going to get to see in this exhibition, Dawoud, right? We're going to be able to walk through the work, not just in its thematic possibilities, but in these, you know, incredible, this depth of aesthetic inquiry you've made across the medium, right? Through the 40 years of your career.
I've made a lot of, I've thought about the photographic object in a wide range of ways and made work using a number of different material strategies, but the thing that has been important to the work is to keep all of that attached to a subject that really matters.
Exactly.
You know, it's not materiality or scale for scale's sake. There's always a very meaningful narrative and a very real commitment to the things that I make work about. That is the thing for me that keeps the work centered.
Right. One last question.
Hi, my name is Eva, and I'm an undergrad photo student. So you were speaking about like an honest way of representation, but you also did acknowledge how in like the New York school, like the subjectivities around the work were really part of a conversation, and you were also speaking about how the awareness of the photographer that is inherent when you look at a photograph. And so like, I guess then I thought like what kind of honesty was he speaking about, or what kind of representation? Because I think that like there is a specific kind of honesty that falls into it, and I would love to hear like you elaborate more on that. Yeah.
Paraphrase that for me, Sam. I lost the thread of that.
I think that the question is about you expanding on this idea that you spoke of wanting to make an honest photograph, and this idea of honesty in the work. I would kind of maybe add to it, because it seems that in talking about honesty, you're also talking about the truth of photography. And so perhaps...
Not just truth, because you also talked about like yourself, like you talked about like you looking at this specific picture, or like, so it's not just truth, but it's like, maybe like we don't have a word for it, like.
Right. So it's more you would like just to expand more on the idea of more about honesty in the work. And that approach.
All right, maybe we can kind of reset the clock and take a little bit of time.
I know, it's a lot, but perhaps...
this is an interesting question, because part of what I'm suggesting is that for a certain kind of work, which isn't even the kind of work that I'm making now. But the broader question of honesty in relation to photography is kind of problematic in the broader sense. Because the world is not flat and two-dimensional in the way a photograph is. You know, the photographic object is not the world, but it needs the world in order to exist. In relation to going into Harlem, from the outset, initially wanting to make an honest representation of the community. For me, at that time, it meant more allowing the subject to reveal themselves to me, rather than having an idea about the subject and then imposing that idea onto the subject and making work about that. It's kind of like approaching the work as a question and then letting the subjects kind of answer that question, as opposed to believing that one knows and then you go in to make work that confirms what you believe you know, which then keeps you from finding out something else, which may not be the thing that you were initially looking for. So it's a complicated question because, you know, fundamentally there is no truth in a photograph.
Right.
You know, there are edges to the photograph that leave out more. Photographs always leave out more than they include.
Right.
That's kind of fundamental to what a photograph is.
Right.
They always leave out more than they include.
And that's the choice, intention, action of the photographer, right? So that's what puts back into the conversation the idea of this artistic expression and the way in which it manifests in the object that gets made. Yeah.
It's true, and you know, I've made photographs, I've made portraits of couples that actually aren't couples.
Right,
And,
right.
And I've had people get upset.
Right.
Like I tricked them.
Right, into...
Because they're made in a way that's very credible. I wanted to make a photograph about a couple. And so I made a couple. I asked this person if they would stand with this person, and we made a photograph about a couple. Not that they were a couple.
Right, but about...
Yeah, it's a photograph about a couple.
Exactly.
And I needed someone to enact that idea with. And of course, part of the challenge is it's made in a very real environment. They're made at a bus stop, and they look like they're made within something that most people would probably call the documentary tradition, which is presumed that there's some inherent fundamental underlying truth to it because it looks a certain way. But
It's how,
it's
how we read it and how we understand it.
It's how we read it, and I want the work to be taken in by the viewer.
Yeah.
I don't want my hand to be too revealed in the work. I want the viewer to come to the work and take the work in within the frame that I have created, within the conceptual framework that I have created for this work. You know, the Underground Railroad photograph, you know, people have written that Dawoud Bey documents the path of the Underground Railroad. I didn't do any such thing. I don't even know what that is. You know, I'm reimagining within proximity to where I know the Underground Railroad may have been. It's northeastern Ohio. You have to pass through the northeastern Ohio landscape to get to Lake Erie. Were you there? Were you over there? Were you up there? No one ever knew. So if I choose to make a photograph over there, I'm within the space of the experience that I'm making work about, even as I'm not documenting the work. So without documenting, I still wanted to resonate with a sense of palpable present, history, the tension of the past and present, but it's not meant to document anything. And I think a little bit of that impulse was lingering when I made the Harlem USA work. But after the Harlem USA work, this notion of trying to make something that in fact could be verified in that kind of way just became less interesting and less challenging to me.
And I think we benefit from the fact that you took that path because it's given us this sort of rich and incredible body of work. So Dawoud, I want to thank you because, as I said, the opportunity for this conversation was not only to take this path through your incredible work, but also because so much of the way I understand the Studio Museum has come through the presence of you and your work in the life of the museum, and the way in which my understanding of who we are comes through the way in which you've existed in it. You know, I'll say many of you, you know, I have the opportunity that I have had to encounter Dawoud's work, your work all over the world, right? To see it in collections, in exhibitions. And I always tie it to the way in which you as an artist sort of live with this work as such an important way for us to understand the possibility and the power of art and what it can be when it enters these spaces called museums and how it can shift and change them. And thinking about that from the beginning to the work now is what gives me so much inspiration. So I want to thank you for that, and also thank you always for the way in which you make me think about the ways in which photography has to be thought and rethought as we encounter it in these uses of this medium as it lives in the world now. So thank you for that, and thank you for being part of our world.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask
Dawoud, Thelma, thank you. And thank you all for being here. My name is Cheyenne Marcano, and I am the Senior Coordinator of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Tonight's very inspiring program was made possible by the Lea K. Green Memorial Fund. Thanks to the fund supporters, the program is free and open to the public. If you would like to support the fund and continuing to make these programs possible, members of our development team will be around and are happy to take names. Otherwise, you can contact our development office at any time in the future. Before I invite you all to join us in the foyer for a reception, I have a special announcement to share on behalf of the museum. In 2020, for our 5th annual Lea K. Green Artist Talk, we are thrilled to honor artists Hank Willis Thomas and Titus Kafar. While the location of the talk will be announced at a later date, please mark Thursday, March 12th on your calendars. We'll see you then, but for now, have a wonderful evening, and thank you for your continued support of the Studio Museum in Harlem.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheyenne. Thank you.